Not jump to the conclusion that I believe that there are, aliens coming from another planet. But I'm open to that. And I think that it's our responsibility, especially when we're seeing that we have a government that is actively blocking information from us. Just last night, I tried to get an amendment onto the National Defense Authorization Act that fit in the germaneness of that bill to have UAP disclosure. And conveniently, it was named non-germane, mostly deemed by staff, not even an elected official. This is the kind of stuff that we repeatedly see. Last year, we were blocked by someone in House administration from being able to receive a full briefing from Arrow. So not an elected official, but someone in staff blocked us. And I've had it. Enough is enough. I want to cue up a video that I've been given. And as before it starts, I'm going to describe, this was taken October 30th of 2024. This video is of an MQ-9 drone tracking an orb, or this object, off the coast of Yemen. You'll see that another MQ-9 launched a Hellfire missile. That you cannot see that drone. And so I'm not going to explain it to you. You'll see exactly what it does. This is when it zoomed out. You can still see it traveling. So, Mr. Knapp, have you heard about events like this occurring? And what information might you have?
I have heard about events like this. I have heard about this event. Jeremy Corbell and I talked about it in one of our episodes a while back. We did not have the video, though. There are servers where there's a whole bank of these kind of videos that Congress has not been allowed to see, that the public hasn't been allowed to see. Occasionally, some of that stuff gets out in the wild and it comes our way. It should be going to you. The public should be seeing this stuff. And why you're not allowed to, I don't know. But that's a Hellfire missile smacking into that UFO and just bounced right off. And it kept going.
It kept going, and it looks like the debris was taken with it.
Yeah, what the hell is that?
One of these occasions that stood out to me the most was when Gabe Valdez and Edmund Gomez teamed up with a Yakaria tribal police officer as well as a fish and game officer to hunt down one of these strange lights and aircraft that everyone was seeing in town and on the reservation. The men had been tracking down the lights they were observing all night in separate vehicles to cover more ground. But every time they'd get even remotely close to cornering them, the craft or light would zip off in a different direction and wind up miles away from them in a second. This was until one of the men came up with an idea to try and only speak in their native Apache language to see if it helped. And to my surprise, and I'm sure to everyone else's at the time too, switching languages over the radio had greatly helped them in their efforts that night. When speaking Apache, the men were then able to easily corner the craft near the gas buggy area, not far from Dulce in Carson National Forest. To be more detailed about the event that occurred that night, the four men had surrounded the craft in this semi-mountainous wooded area with tall pine trees scattered around everyone. One of the tribal officers positioned on the northern side of the craft was supposed to be the person responsible for the task of shooting down whatever they had encountered. And trust me, I know how wild that sounds. But when the time finally came and the tribal officer raised his rifle to the craft, it disappeared. Not for the rest of the men. They were still able to see it slowly hovering over the tribal officer with the rifle. But the man reportedly tasked with shooting down the aircraft hadn't seen anything and told the others that all he was able to hear were the sounds of a small tractor lawnmower over his head. According to Officer Valdez, when driving back home on that night, the men had cornered that specific aircraft. Gabe had allegedly seen this bright light follow his police car closely for some time before it came close to his cruiser and then turned in a 90-degree angle before zipping off into the night, almost like it was acknowledging Gabe's efforts to track it down, and it just wrapped back around to say goodbye for the night. When everyone returned the next day to better assess what happened in the gas buggy area, they determined that the craft's dimensions, according to the lights they saw, had measured approximately 150 by 150 feet, making this mystery ship one of the largest crafts of this whole story around New Mexico. But it's not the largest craft that we'll talk about by a long shot. Aside from authoring his only book titled Dulce Base, The Truth and Evidence from the Case Files of Gabe Valdez, covering his father's investigative work, Greg Valdez had also put a substantial amount of investigative effort himself towards this story. He would accompany his father on many calls to mutilation sites and would even be physically present during some of the most crucial parts of the story on the mountain and mesa. To give you an example I already mentioned, Greg was in the vehicle when his father drove to the Dulce airport and argued with the pilots of the Chinook helicopters. Greg Valdez was there to watch Paul Benowitz shakenly get out of the news helicopter along with the rest of the news crew. He was even able to verify how both of the CH-47s were fully loaded with armed personnel. Another example was when Greg was with his dad and many others who were escorted on an overnight expedition around the Archuleta Mesa and mountain. He claimed to have experienced a familiar situation that happened to his father near the gas buggy area. During this overnight expedition, Greg said that he observed a bright light flying in the distance towards the northern face of Mount Archuleta just before it had begun to create these plasmic sparks around the hole and shortly vanished into thin air. This is a common theme, by the way, regarding UFOs that incorporate anti-gravitic and electrostatic technology. They tend to give off sparks as they transition into different modes and convert energy at higher speeds. Apparently, very few people in that instance could see the bright light and craft, while most of the others encompassing the expedition group were seemingly oblivious to its presence in the area. Another similar example of ocular camouflage for these crafts had occurred under Gabe Valdez's watch while he was out on patrol one evening. He and another tribal officer had seen one of these lights or crafts hovering in the distance through their night vision cameras and decided to try and attempt to make contact. The tribal officer chose to stay back with the night vision camera to observe the strange light as Gabe approached it blindly. As the men were talking back and forth through their walkie-talkies, Gabe was cautiously walking out to the area where the men were observing the light until the tribal officer told him to stop. Even as Officer Valdez was standing directly under this light, which was visible to the tribal officer through the camera, Gabe couldn't see it, and it was as if nothing was there. On another night, with his trusted night vision scope, Officer Valdez at the time had documented that he had seen several small crafts eject from the bottom of a large orange orb of light that hovered over Mundo Ridge. The smaller crafts would leave and make a few movements around the area and then return into this perceived mothership that Gabe had witnessed. It should be noted that just like the other example previously discussed, this mothership orb of light and smaller crafts were only able to be seen with the night vision scope that Gabe had on hand. Now that we started to focus on what flies in the sky, let's talk about one of the most important aspects of this whole story as it pertains to covert aircraft. It began when Gabe had gone on an expedition around Mount Archuleta with Bill McGarity. Bill wasn't his real name, apparently. He also went by the name of Jason Bishop. Regardless of whether either of those names were real, he was, and he did have verified credentials at the time for investigators like Gabe and Edmund to believe that he was employed with Los Alamos National Laboratories. Interestingly enough, though, this Bill McGarity or Jason Bishop individual also held credentials for Area 51 and was one of the men responsible for the electrical systems on the covert project that produced the F-117 Nighthawk. But to get back on track, Gabe was out on one occasion with Bill McGarity exploring the mountainside for evidence of what Paul Benowitz had informed him about. Throughout the expedition, Gabe would take random photos with his camera of the area for future reference of where they were in the forest surrounded by so many towering trees. I'll note that Gabe Valdez was not really expecting to capture anything himself aside from rocky outcroppings, scattered pylons, and tall pine trees. Remember that this was the 1980s, and the best people had to work with were printed maps to give them a precise knowledge of where they were located. Taking occasional pictures back then, as Gabe did, was supposed to be like a photographic breadcrumb trail. It was only after analyzing the developed photos that Gabe realized what he had caught on camera. Unbeknownst to Gabe, Bill, and others with them at the time, Officer Valdez had accidentally photographed what looked to be a black rounded craft in one of the images that was seemingly tailing them as they were exploring the area. According to Greg Valdez, that image was one of the most important pieces of genuine evidence regarding this entire Dulce story. When looking at the image, since the craft was some distance away, it could be argued that it looked like a bulky black helicopter with no visible rotors as rendered in the image. Or it could have been another delta-shaped craft that dispelled some kind of thin ionized trail behind it. I could be wrong, and perhaps it's something that's like tic-tac shaped, or maybe it was built to mislead people of its exotic technology and appear as some familiar method of aviation to us. Because Bill McGarity was present during this outing on Mount Archuleta, Gabe had asked him if he could take the developed image and have experts enlarge it at the Los Alamos labs to see if they could gather any further details from it. Even though Bill McGarity was a shady figure, he thankfully brought back the enlarged image to Gabe, and it appeared to show an intriguing symbol on the aircraft. According to Greg Valdez, the craft appeared to have a reverse swastika insignia on it, or something that resembled a radio electromagnetic transmission signal turbine. I know how that might sound, and I would like to note that my previous statement isn't supposed to draw some connection that the secret aircraft was a Nazi experimental ship or anything of that nature. It's mentioned to embody the possible notion that the invisible aircraft might have functioned electromagnetically. Although Bill returned to Dulce with the enlarged image, he wouldn't stay long and told Gabe that he couldn't provide him with any copies of the image because his contacts in Los Alamos would lose their jobs if the enlarged version were to ever be made public. What's important to remember is that these crafts were said by locals in Paul Benowitz to have routinely flown in particular paths along Mundo Ridge and Coyote Canyon near Kirkland. This may seem like a random piece of information to mention, yet Greg Valdez had traced these crafts' flight paths with Paul's help. It's a good thing that he did this too, because he realized the eerie connection that showed the various sets of trails or unidentified pylons that led these crafts conveniently back to national laboratories like the Los Alamos and Sandia facilities. In short, the government, along with the military, knows and has known about these mysterious flying craft and lights in the sky for a long time. You could say that they've been keeping a good track since 1947. This is all probably because they were the ones flying them in 1985, and it's likely why Mr. McGarity and Jason Bishop refused to give Gabe the enlarged photograph that he personally took. You can rest assured that the intelligence community and military have kept good track of a decent amount of them, at least since the transfer of knowledge during Operation Paperclip and the founding of the Advanced Research Projects Agency in 1958. Also known as ARPA, which later had been slightly altered and rebranded so that the agency could be pushed more towards a defensive posture and become the Pentagon's brain, called DARPA. If that term or terms sound familiar to you, then perhaps you've read either of Annie Jacobson's books on the subjects or seen her titles like The Pentagon's Brain and Operation Paperclip somewhere. I'll have to make another video in the future discussing these historical agencies and operations, along with the exotic material collected and the blueprints that the Allies gathered from the Nazis as the Third Reich was reaching the end of its tyrannical reign in the 1940s. Don't forget that other countries exist with space agencies and UAP or UFO identification programs. When investigators say they, especially in reference to these strange aircraft, it's usually about the CIA, the NSA, the DOE, the Air Force, the Army, DARPA, NASA, and companies such as Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works division, just to name a few. We'll discuss more later about William Redding and his blowpipe company, along with how his alleged ownership of the Redding War Ranch still fits into this gigantic picture once we finally discuss the portion of the story that involves underground bases and the alleged entrances to the Dulce base. Separate from the military experiences and documented sightings of strange craft by Paul Benowitz and Gabe Valdez, you might be surprised to hear that Richard Doty had his own craft story that he shared with Greg Bishop in Project Beta. Supposedly, the event in question occurred at the same site and runway that was used to test fly the F-117 Nighthawk. According to Greg Bishop, it was Doty's first UFO experience, and it made a lasting impression on his superiors. One night when Doty was standing outside what was described to be a medium-sized hangar, he stated to Greg that he saw a dull black craft in the shape of a disc be hauled from outside the hangar on the back of a large trailer that was being pulled by an immensely large truck. According to Doty, he had witnessed the craft start up without making any noise and had stated that it only emitted a blue electric coronal discharge that came from the bottom of the craft to signify that it was running. Doty then told Greg Bishop that he watched the craft fly up into the sky about 200 feet and had just begun flying in small circles while the semi-truck and trailer moved off from the tarmac. On another night, Doty had reportedly overheard one of the engineers for the craft state that he had believed they could bring it into space, which may not seem like much new information when considering what it was, but to the intelligence community, any information is potentially dangerous information if it's used improperly or placed in the wrong hands. When Doty was questioned later by a superior, he allegedly acknowledged seeing the craft and was told that he had seen what's generally called a UFO. Apparently, that one he had seen was on loan. I'm not sure who it was loaned from, but I found Doty's witness statement in Project Beta to be interesting enough to include in the video. I've mentioned this before, but people like Bill Moore and Special Agent Doty shouldn't be viewed as villains in this Dulce story. Honestly, you shouldn't really hold any animosity towards any name mentioned over the course of this video, with perhaps the exclusion of men like Dr. Clarence Lushbaugh. Practically everyone involved in this who didn't have a god complex was either used, manipulated, or taken advantage of at some point or another. This would definitely pertain to Richard Doty's story, since he and Colonel Ernest Edwards, Doty's former superior in the Air Force's chain of command, were pretty much railroaded when they were sent to Germany and made the fall guys for the intel community to punish. For the US intelligence world, people needed to be held responsible for leaking so much or any kind of truthful information to Paul Benowitz. Paul's feverish yet highly detailed letters to politicians had, in one hand, helped Gabe Valdez in his quest for answers regarding the cattle mutilation phenomenon, while in the other, it had simultaneously ruined the professional careers and reputations of two military intelligence men who were, in a way, whistleblowers themselves. Regardless of the amount of accurate information that was shared while Doty was an OSI agent, you have to realize that the orders were more than likely coming down to Doty from much higher up, likely originating in their plans well above the position of even Edwards to people like the elusive Falcon figure who are practically untrackable. Despite the mixed bag of experiences that defined Richard Doty's Air Force career, his first military UFO story that he told Greg Bishop was something that I found to be fascinating. If he was telling the truth about the encounter, then it might even be one of the first iterations of a certain type of experimental aircraft, but more specifically spacecraft, aptly labeled as a radially configured shuttlecraft by entities like NASA. As a brief introduction, the term was used by the BDM Corporation during the mid to late 20th century. Yet I will refrain from discussing the specific topic of shuttlecrafts further so I can later on appropriately break down the subject concerning flying saucers and tic-tac shaped UFOs in greater detail. One aspect of these interwoven stories that I would like to touch on before we move on to the next portion of our story on this yellow brick road of disinformation to Oz's underground fortress relates to black helicopters that people reported seeing around these craft sightings and mutilation sites. It's very possible that these helicopters were classified stealth versions of the Chinook and Black Hawk helicopters that have been used around the globe for countless operations. Honestly, we probably would have never been told about the classified stealth Black Hawk if one hadn't been shot down during the Osama bin Laden raid that took place during the dead of night in Pakistan. What people must understand is the regularity of bizarreness that occurs to these people that live on tribal lands and in the middle of nowhere. Things that appear supernatural occur all the time to these people that ordinary citygoers would think of as complete myth, legend, and fiction. Yet to these people, it's very real and normalized to the point where they don't even feel the need to talk about it with outsiders like you think they should or would. What does draw some unwanted attention from them, though, are the unmarked and quiet flying black helicopters that could only be from the federal government or US military. You see, One thing that tribal members and rural country people have in common is their general disdain for the U.S. federal government. This is not an opinion that I hold, it's just a simple and humble observation. I hope you paid attention in history class, because there's kind of a reason for Native American tribes to have such distrust in the feds. Just look at the decimation of the American bison population to see how far the government went to wipe out the Native American way of life. Things on the reservations and living off the fat of the land, so to speak, isn't what it used to be, since hard drugs, alcohol, and the pursuit of money were forcibly integrated into their culture. Actually, there are so many day-to-day problems on a plethora of reservations that tribal members need to worry about, that strange lights in the sky or weird creatures being seen at night prowling around in the desert might actually seem like a pleasant momentary distraction rather than terrifying and traumatic experiences to share with the world. I mean, some of these reservations deal with rampant human and drug trafficking, rape, suicide, and murder rates that largely remain unspoken by the broader news media and society. It's a vulnerable population that continues to be taken advantage of by the federal government and criminal underworld to this day. By the same token, I hope you do some additional research into how many military test facilities and potentially dangerous experiments were done near tribal lands and rural towns. With all of this being said, I think we should begin to specifically break down as much of the technology that's been both officially and unofficially seen, drawn, photographed, filmed, and written about in this story. I think, oddly enough, the easiest crafts to analyze first are the ones Paul Benowitz filmed repeatedly over the Manzano test range in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I say oddly enough, as they are practically the only craft that I will discuss which is described more like a light by Benowitz than an actual aircraft or spacecraft, and was mostly observed by Paul flying around at night. Also, Paul saw and photographed other kinds of aerial vehicles during the day, and that should be mentioned. It's thought that many of these more classical and in some cases manned UFOs had utilized technology that was based on those original lights that he was filming. One prominent incident where police officers in New Mexico had allegedly encountered one of these experimental crafts was in the Socorro UFO incident. It was reported that Officer Lonnie Zamora had described seeing a white egg or pill-shaped craft at close range that landed in the desert with two pilots who had allegedly exited the craft. He initially saw this strange craft as the officers were in the middle of a pursuit of a runaway vehicle. The important aspect of that particular incident was the tripod landing gear that the officers described to other investigators. These tripod indentations left on the ground were the same dimensions as the ones repeatedly left at all of the mutilation sites, at least in the southwestern United States. Additionally, in briefly explaining how these first crafts operated to the best of my ability, it should provide you with a better grasp of how others will function too. I should have prefaced that I intend to discuss a myriad of crafts along with the various propulsion methods applied to them